So it's important to think about what type of feedback and comments you get and look for patterns, and then turn that into a look at what you wish people knew about you. So what I want to do is dive into one case study from a newsroom we've done some work with around a specific investigation and the kind of feedback they get. Let me make one other point about responding to comments and that human touch I was mentioning. Think about whose job it is in your newsroom to respond to comments. Like ideally it's something a lot of people share, but if you have people who are actually tasked with this, try to make it people who like humans, try to make it people who enjoy interactions and are likely to give people the benefit of the doubt. A lot of times there's a real defensiveness in how journalists respond, and believe me, we understand the defensiveness. We understand the urge to say, gosh, you don't know anything at all, or to explain how an error happened in a way that, shows what a hurry we were in, or somebody gave us bad information, or, and matching people's tone. There's such a natural inclination if someone's being a jerk to you to be a jerk back. Do try to have your comment strategy and your engagement strategy steered by somebody who, for whom politeness comes naturally, and that sort of respect and, a gentler touch will go an awful long way. Sometimes when journalists jump in to defend themselves, they can do more harm than good when they respond angrily or in a way that that doesn't invite trust. It is important, however, to think through who you're responding to when you respond to comments, because a lot of times it feels like, why would I bother responding to somebody because they're just being a jerk or because their comment is so misinformed? But remember that when you respond to public comments, you're responding not just to the person who has the question or the comment, but to everyone else who's reading. So many people read comments and don't leave them themselves. So if somebody makes an accusation about you, if you respond to that accusation, even if you feel like that person maybe doesn't deserve it or isn't persuadable or doesn't believe in facts, you're not just responding to that person, you are depriving that person of having the last word, and you're responding to everybody else who might have read the comment to begin with. So let's look at a feedback that an investigative team for a newsroom that was then Gatehouse and is now Gannett at the Sarasota Herald Tribune. They did a really important investigation around midwives and how midwives are licensed and regulated and tracked, and how midwives are held accountable, basically. What they did, what has become pretty standard practice in the industry, to have a page about the investigation where they explain why they were doing this story, what sort of tipped them off to it, what kind of records they investigated. We obtained 10 years of data from the CDC. We created a database that hadn't been done. Here's what we based our analysis on. Our analysis showed that infants are 3 times more likely to die with midwife-assisted home births than with midwife-assisted hospital births. And here's what the risk factors are there. So they did this work, they published their investigation, and they heard quite a bit from their audience. So I want to point out that they got a lot of really positive feedback, and I'll show you some examples of that to this investigation. And there were a lot of readers who were grateful for it. What I'm showing you today, with their permission, is themes that came up in the negative conversation that they got. This, pretty much always happens. If you publish an investigation, there's somebody who did not want you to shine a light in that particular way and is just mad that you did it, or doesn't like the angle you took on it, or finds it unfair. So what we're gonna do is look for themes that came up in the feedback they got specifically on Facebook. So here's somebody saying, they're continuing, the Sarasota Herald Tribune is continuing to show their bias. The only reason they're covering this is because of X. There was controversy over why the owner of a birth center was leaving, and he's saying you got the reason wrong about why she was leaving. Here's somebody saying there must be a financial connection with the Sarasota Memorial Hospital and the Herald Tribune. Why don't we ever hear about infant deaths at the hospital? They must be suppressing that on purpose, because the business of being born means that they want the hospital to look better than the independent birth center. Somebody else is saying these types of stories are done to assist with legislation that the medical profession wants to force out competition. No coincidence that this piece was done just prior to this year's legislative session. So as a journalist, it can feel so weird to read this. You're like, really? They really think that journalists in the newsroom have decided to do this because there's time to get legislation passed in Tallahassee. But yes, that is indeed what people think. So we can wish that weren't true and we can find it ridiculous, but nobody but us is going to correct the record. Somebody else says this is a scare tactic article. Do your research and work with a respectable midwife. They see lost revenue and scare tactics as their resource. They're trying to get people to go to the hospital. Shame on you for resorting to fear mongering and slander. It's completely biased and grossly inaccurate. It's a smear campaign. It's a personal vendetta for these journalists. So I'm not showing you, but trust me that it was there. Really good job done by the journalists of responding. They spent a lot of hours responding and correcting individual comments, asking for examples. Not a single time that I saw that somebody said this was inaccurate. And they jumped in and said, you know, please, if there are inaccuracies, we invite you to point those out. I did not see anywhere that follow-up occurred. Gatehouse Media is a propaganda machine and constantly churning out intentionally inflammatory dribble. So maybe most of your readers don't believe that, but some of them do, and this person does, and we don't want to let them have the last word. Why aren't they covering all the unnecessary drugs and C-sections in hospitals? And so again, that idea of like an investigation often goes very deep on one slice of something, but to other people, none of that matters if they just don't know why you're not addressing all this other stuff. So here's Emily Lacaze, is one of the editors on the project, and she said we interviewed more than 100 people to try to understand that. You can read about our process here. And someone else saying, you know, it's biased reporting, follow the money, you can't hurt your biggest advertiser. So again, assuming a connection between the hospital. So what we like to do, like might be too strong a word because it can be very demoralizing hard work sometimes, but it's very important to spend time with these comments. Very important to figure out what they're actually saying. Remove the tone and just turn it into what assumptions are people actually making about journalism. So here's what I see when I look at those comments. People assume journalists have a bias against midwives. They assume that that bias led journalists to look at some data and purposely avoid other data. They assume that the journalists are one-sided because this story was not looking at the data of doctor-assisted hospital births. They assume the newspaper is making money by making hospitals appear safer, and they assume that the newspaper wants to help push anti-midwife legislation. So each of those things is an assumption that your readers are making about your work, and that if they make those assumptions, they might not even access your work. They might not give it enough trust to consume it properly because they assume that it's not worthy of trust because it's based on that premise. So we turn those into information gaps. What might you be able to explain about your work that would correct those misassumptions? So here are things, if you turn those into questions, why did the journalist invest so much time in this story? What sort of neutral questions did the journalist set out to answer? Are these births safe? Are some births safer than others? And what are the factors, right? Who did the journalist interview? What data was consulted and why was that the right data? How did the journalist work to be fair? How was the journalism funded and who owns the newspaper? These last two are not things that most journalists think about answering in their day-to-day, but if people are assuming that advertising money is determining coverage, man, that's a misconception we want to clear up, right? So we try to address these information gaps. And then we talk about who will address those gaps. You might have guessed already, but our firm view is that you need to address those gaps, that we need to both be ready to respond to comments when they come up publicly, especially, and also be ready to proactively explain, tell the story of our work, make those about this investigation pages more detailed, and be ready to continually refer back to them. So just a quick follow-up. The editors at the Herald Tribune did continue to write about the feedback they were getting and correct misassumptions. You know, as the editor of this 9-month investigation, I would like to fact check some of the claims that were made. And they also did get some really amazing feedback. An event was actually held in Florida soon after the investigation came out of people who had had adverse, you know, births were midwife-assisted home births where things had gone wrong and felt like they were given a voice for the first time. And there was actually action taken in Tallahassee as well. So a lot of good impact came out of the investigation. So whenever I talk about this, I want to highlight that as well.